Hello everyone, today we would be doing a bit of investigation on the Korean War from IB syllabus perspective. The Korean War basically was a result of the Truman Doctrine which stated that the USA would help people to fight against communism. In 1950, the USA showed that this was more than words. US troops went to war to stop the spread of communism in Korea. Here, in this lesson, we would be talking uh, of the following details or subtitles. What is the Korean War? What are the causes? How it started? Its lasting effect and the impact in general. If you see the map here, this clearly demarcates and clearly shows the geographical location of North Korea and the South Korea, and North Korea and South Korea are separated by a 38-degree parallel. What is Korean War? The Korean War started when North Korea invaded South Korea and US aided South Korea. US aided South Korea. China and Soviet Union helped North Korea. Another name for the war, sometimes in South Korea, is termed as 6.25 War, and in North Korea it is termed as Fatherland Liberation War. We will be discussing a couple of causes. There were two different political governments in Korea, and both more of communism in North Korea, and South Korea had an elected leader who was very unpopular, and the whole intention was to unify a whole of Korea. The North had their own election. The election and the dividing of Korea happened. How it started? The war started on June 25, 1950, and it ended on July 27, 1953. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung wanted to unite Korea by force. The US and the Soviet Union had differences which prevented the North and South to negotiate a unification treaty. Before I go to the overview, I would just quickly talk about what exactly we are wanting here. The whole thing here was that the US, as per the Truman Doctrine, it stated that the USA would help people fight against communism. In 1950, the USA showed that this was more than words. US troops went to war to stop the spread of communism in Korea. The divided land. The Japanese controlled Korea between 1904 and 1905. At the end of the Second World War, Korea was in a situation similar to Germany. Russian forces were in the north of Korea and American troops had landed in the south. Korea became divided into two at the 38th parallel. In 1948, separate Korean governments were set up in the north and south of the country. A communist, Kim Il-sung, took power in the north. From 1948, the president of South Korea was the anti-communist Syngman Rhee. He was a corrupt leader and he soon became very unpopular. In April 1950, Rhee did badly in elections. Many of the people of South voted in favor of unification with the communist state of the North. If you see in this map, we have China on the northern front, which is facing and touching the border of North Korea, and with the capital Pyongyang. On the south, we have South Korea. At the peak, we see Pusan, which was occupied, more occupied by U.S. and Japanese. Invasion. On 25th of June 1950, North Korean troops invaded the south in a bid to reunite Korea by force. Historians agree and disagree about whether the North Koreans were told to invade by the Russians. Truman believed that the Russians were behind the attack and that it was a test of the US policy of containing communists. The invasion came at a time when many Americans were extremely worried about the challenge of communism. China had recently become a communist state. In September 1949, the Americans found out that the USSR had nuclear weapons. American politicians became convinced that communists wanted to take over the world. On hearing the news from Korea, Truman immediately ordered US forces in Japan, led by General MacArthur, to help South Korea. Before I proceed further, I would quickly cover the key stakeholders in the war. Kim Il-sung, he was leader of the North. He was a communist, hardcore communist, wanted to unite Korea by force. He insisted on the war, thought that a peaceful reunification was impossible, sent his military across the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950. He attacked with many World War II Russian tanks. Forces were installed around Daegu and Busan. The installing is known as Busan Perimeter. The technology behind North Korea's armored infantry was either Russian or Chinese. On the other hand, South Korea was more occupied by Japanese and Americans. The other important stakeholder was President Syngman Rhee. He was leader of South Korea. He wanted to unite Korea, but he was very highly unpopular. His forces were no match to the North. He was proved to be a corrupt leader. He was anti-communist. He became very unpopular. As I said, he voted in favor of unification with the communist state of the North. Third key stakeholder and most important person in this war was General Douglas MacArthur. He was commander of the US forces in the Pacific. He wanted to cross the 38th parallel. He was fired by President Truman for insubordination because he wanted to bomb bases in China, and he was proved to not following the order of the President Truman. Number 4 among the key stakeholders was Stalin. He tried to prevent war and then later agreed and started preparing the soldiers for war. He gave the Chinese some air cover for crossing the bridge over the Yellow River. He lived up till March 1953. The sixth and one of the most important person in the Korean War was President Truman. He ordered American air and naval units into action by June 27, 1950. He responded to the invasion by giving support to the French in Vietnam. He agreed to the UN forces moving into North Korea, but though doing this would bring Soviet Union of China into war. Was criticized for making a lot of mistakes, such as sending troops to Korea without the approval of Congress. He was the one who fired General Douglas MacArthur for insubordination. I'll quickly talk about the US counterattack and the invasion. I already covered a part of invasion. Let me quickly recap it. On 25 June 1950, North Korea troops invaded the South in a bid to reunite Korea by force. The invasion came at a time when many Americans were extremely worried about the challenge of communism. Truman ordered US forces in Japan led by General MacArthur to help South Korea. Soldiers from a number of countries fought in Korea, including Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The bulk of the UN forces were provided by the USA. In the US counterattack, at first the North Korean attack was very successful. Within 4 days, the southern capital of Seoul has been captured. The North Koreans conquered all the country except for a small area in south around the town of Pusan. In July 1950, MacArthur sent American forces to Pusan and prepared for a counterattack. The US fought back again in September. MacArthur organized a successful amphibious attack in the town of Incheon. At the same time, US forces broke out of the Pusan area. The counterattack went extremely well, and by 1st of October, the US troops had reached the 38th parallel, the original border between North and South Korea. The Americans faced a dilemma. Should they push on and invade North Korea? They now had a chance to go beyond containment and roll back the frontiers of communism. On the other hand, there was a possibility that by invading the North and the Americans might provoke China to join the war. And of course, North Korea was backed by Russians. MacArthur was keen to go on. Truman approved the change of policy and the US forces crossed the 38th parallel on 7th October. Eventually, MacArthur troops reached the Yellow River, close to the Chinese border. This was the first time since 1945 that Americans had tried to liberate a communist state. However, there was a substantial risk of Chinese intervention. Communist China was a new force in the world. Few people believed that they would risk war with the mighty USA. In early October, the Chinese issued a statement that said, "China will not sit back with folded hands and let the Americans come to the border." The Americans ignored this warning and continued to march north. On the 10th of October, the Chinese government said the Chinese troops would attack the Americans if MacArthur continued. However, MacArthur ignored this threat. The Chinese intervened finally. At the end of October, Chinese troops went into action and attacked South Korean and American troops. In November, the South Koreans and Americans were forced to retreat. Truman and MacArthur were not put off by the Chinese intervention. Thousands of soldiers were killed. Britain and France wanted Truman to talk to the Chinese. The advice from these allies was ignored. Instead, MacArthur planned a further push towards the Chinese border. This renewed attack began on 25th of November. It went badly wrong. MacArthur made a big mistake. He divided the forces in two and marched north. The Chinese had little difficulty in attacking and destroying many of the US forces. And finally, MacArthur had to retreat, and the Chinese soon took control of almost all of North Korea. Once again, it was turn of the communist forces to push over the border into South Korea. The Chinese offensive continued into the new year. On 1st of January, they crossed 38th parallel, and on the 4th of January, they took the southern capital, Seoul. Tables were turned off. The success of the Chinese caused great disappointment in America. They were behind the scenes argument about what to do next. General MacArthur recommended extreme action. Truman hinted at a press conference that he might drop the atomic bomb of China. Basically, they tried threatening China with the atomic bomb. The British government were appealed by talks of using atom bombs and invading China. The British Prime Minister Attlee flew to Washington and asked Truman to negotiate with the Chinese. ultimately failed to get the Americans to talk to the Chinese, but Truman did stop talking about dropping the atom bomb. Finally, MacArthur's advice on December 1950 was the US should consider all methods to defeat the Chinese, which could include the use of atom bomb against China, even though allies were totally against it. The war should be extended to the Chinese mainland in order to cut off the supply of the communist forces in Korea. The ultimate aim of the war should not be only the recapture of North Korea but also the defeat of communists in China and, you know, set up an example. Finally, the fall of MacArthur happened. On February 1951, America launched a further attack on the communist troops. By March, the communist forces has been pushed back to the original border 38th parallel. At this point, MacArthur disagreed with Truman. Truman now abandoned the idea of conquering all of Korea and was considering making peace with China, and also because of the substantial pressure from allies. For a long time, there had been tensions between Truman and MacArthur. This now reached breaking point. On 24th of March, MacArthur made a public statement criticizing the idea of a deal with Chinese. Truman was annoyed when he heard this. MacArthur wanted to cross the border again in order to reconquer North Korea. But he sent a message to an American politician explaining his view that America should keep fighting until the Chinese were defeated, which made Truman very angry, and that the general was trying to control the war instead of obeying his orders. And in April, MacArthur was dismissed. This caused a sensation in the United States. A general being dismissed. Please see the slides. In this slide, you will see a letter about General MacArthur being fired. It describes why he was being fired. If you go through the content of the letter, it clearly says that whatever orders, or there have been a straightforward disobedience of orders by the general. And it was a sort of a very sensational stuff for United States. Finally, the stalemate. By early 1951, the two sides in the Korean War has reached a stalemate. Thousands of soldiers expired. The Chinese launched a huge push south in April and May, but it was not successful. The loss of life on the Chinese side was enormous, and also on the American side. In these 2 months, over 2 lakh men were killed. Peace talks began in July 1951. But there was no agreed ceasefire. Sporadic but bloody fighting continued. It's estimated close to 45,000 American troops were killed or wounded in 1951 and 1952. Situation getting worse. There was immense pressure from the allies to stop the war, have a ceasefire. As the months passed, the situation becomes similar to the Western Front in the First World War, with both sides dug into a strong defensive positions. The situation continued throughout the second half of 1951 and through the whole of 1952. Soldiers continued to be killed in large numbers on both the sides. Between the start of the talks and November 1952, 45,000, as I said, American troops were killed or wounded. At the end of 1952, the American elected a new president, K. Eisenhower. The new president took power in January 1953. One of the topmost agenda for the president when took over the office was to end the war. An agreement to stop fighting was eventually signed on July 27, 1953. Overall, there was not a clear, the whole attempt was to stop the fight, was to stop communism, as simple as that, which resulted in lot of things. First, a blockade between General MacArthur and President Truman. Thousands of soldiers, lakhs of soldiers were killed, both sides altogether. Third, Russia and China actually backed North Korea. South Korea was backed by Japan and USA, of course. USA was number one in providing soldiers. However, there were resources from Australia. There were soldiers from Australia, Germany, and other places as well. At first, if I have to summarize, at first, North Korea tried to capture South Korea, and then reversal happened. South Korea, supported by US and Japan, crossed 38th parallel, reached out till the river or near the Chinese border. After that, China also took part in the war. So there was not a clear, direct, if someone has to investigate it, there was no clear winner in this war. But overall it resulted on lakhs of people being killed. Okay. Now if I go back to a couple of sources from which we dug up this information, the American view of the dangers of outside help for North Korea was expressed in American magazine of the time. It says the danger of Chinese or Soviet intervention if the North Korean communists are pushed hard to the border is negligible. This was quoted by Life magazine in October 1950. Another quote from The Nation, September 1950, says, if the Chinese should commit their own forces to the struggle in Korea, they would do so knowing that they were inviting a general war. That is the price they are not prepared to pay. However, things happened differently. One of the other sources says the communist view was expressed in a Chinese newspaper. It says we cannot stand idly by when the American imperialist, a notorious enemy, is now expanding its war of aggression against our neighbors and is attempting to expand the aggressive flames to the borders of our country. This was quoted by one of the daily newspaper Kung Janji Pao on 13th of October 1950. Overall, General MacArthur in 1949, one of the sources says that one of the magazine quoted that this US general played a key role in shaping American policy during the Korean War. If I had to summarize the whole of the Korean War, I can segregate it into different phases, and we can we can summarize it on what we think of the communist or the anti-communist, and which was more successful. If I have to break down in the period, I will surely break the key things happened from June 1950 to July 1950, and then September 1950 to October 1950, November 1950 to January 1951, February 1951 to March of 1951, finally April 1951 to May 1951, and the last one July 1951 to July 1953, when the Korean War actually ended. The other thing which can be, or the inferences which can be dug out of this, all the information or all the investigation we have done, whether American policy in Korea was successful or not. If I go back to MacArthur's advice in December 1950, the US should consider all methods to defeat the Chinese, even the atomic bomb against China. Second, the war should be extended to the Chinese mainland in order to cut off supplies to the communist forces in Korea. And third one, the ultimate aim of the war should not only be to recapture of North Korea, but to defeat the communists in China. By then, China was getting very strong. Even though America was a giant, but China was growing in a steeply way. On the other hand, if we talk about President Truman, in the beginning, he was against getting succumbed to the pressure of allies and handshake with the opponents. However, at a later stage, looking at the number of casualties of soldiers, he changed his mind. So overall, we can make up the inference on whether Mr. Truman was correct or General MacArthur. As I said, like Eisenhower, new president came to power and an agreement eventually was signed on 27 July 1953. But before that, I would surely talk about the lasting effects of this war. Approximately Over the course of time, around 10 million people were killed during the war. North Korea lost. The population went down in both North Korea and South Korea. More or less every family has lost family members in that war. And over the period of time, South Korea emerged as world's economic success stories. I would surely talk about the timelines of this war, and it ranges from 1947, 48, 49, 50. 1947, if I have to chalk it down, two different political governments emerged in Korea. Soviet leader believed Korea would unify together and refused to sign a treaty with Kim Il-sung. 1948, South Korea held its first general election. The Republic of Korea was established and was known as the Government of Korea. Number three, in the same year, which is 1948, communist countries recognized the DPKR as the government of North Korea. And number four, the same year, 1948, the key event was Korea becomes permanently divided along the 38th parallel. Stalin tries to prevent war and then later start preparing soldiers for war. And 1950, the war starts. Communist forces captured Seoul, South Korea capital. President Truman ordered American air and naval units into action. Soviet Union joins the war against Kim's invasion. Well, this is a picture of the first version of the atomic bomb, like the one the Americans threatened to use if China didn't stop fighting. I hope the class for last 30 minutes have been useful. Looking forward for your feedback and more inputs to make more productive in my future lessons, forthcoming lessons. Thank you very much.